Hi, this is Dan Bolen, and I'm the guest of my podcast called The Courage to Be Courageous. This is a place where people can come from all of the United States and be able to listen to fear and see those who have embraced it and use courage to overcome it and walk through their fear and be their authentic self. I think you're going to find this podcast today to be exciting, and yet it will be in some ways insightful because we have a very special guest today, and I'd like to introduce him to you. This is Jahn Curran. And Jahn, tell us a little bit about your life. First of all, let's talk a little bit about your education, and then we'll talk about your connection to your career, your family, and a little bit more about that. But let's talk about your education for a minute. Give me some insight on that.
Education. Spent 8 years at BYU studying international relations, Japanese, French, and dance.
Mm-hmm.
Then went back to Japan and worked for a few years before coming back to Thunderbird, American Graduate School of International Management in Phoenix, where I completed a double master's MBA and MIM in international management. Went from there to work in Saudi Arabia. Came back after a number of years, and while I was married, I was accepted at Boston University in their fellowship program for international economics. So I was going to pursue a PhD in international economics. And that was at the time that my wife decided to leave me, and I decided to stay in Utah in order to be close to my kids.
I appreciate you sharing that with us, too. So let's talk a little bit about you were at BYU. I know your mother, I believe, was a nurse, and your father was in the film business. Tell us a little bit about that.
My parents also met at BYU, both of them being very strict Mormon members. And so when I was born, my mother was already graduated with her degree in nursing. She had spent a few years up in Salt Lake working at LDS Hospital, and then gone back to Provo to be with my father while he finished his degree in film. And I was born, and then very quickly my sister and brother, just younger than I am, were also born. And my father graduated from BYU with his degree in '65. And then the whole family relocated to LA, which is where he's from.
Mm-hmm. Very good. And I believe he was in the film business there.
Yeah, he grew up in it. His mother was an actress and bit part, what do they call them? Shoot, not bystanders.
Mm-hmm. Now, they're are they not? Well, I don't want to use the word
background actors. There's a term for it, and now my brain freezes all of a sudden. But in any event, my grandfather was a filmographer, videographer for Clark Gable, and then those two divorced, and then my grandmother married her second husband, whose name I have, Curran, Patrick Curran, and he was a set painter. Grandma Curran continued to act, and she was one of those bathing beauties in the Esther Williams films. 28. If you look down the row, they all dive in synchronized time. That would have been my grandmother, and so my grandparents, they had a rocky relationship, both sets of them. And so my father would sometimes live in LA and sometimes live in southern Utah with other Mormon family members. So he grew up in both places. But by the time I was born, my father had done a number of years with Disney, and he'd done a lot of voice acting for Disney. And I think my mom was intrigued and enthralled when she met him because he had all these connections with famous actors. And when they moved to LA, my mom was a kind of a country farm girl from Idaho, and LA was a very different experience for her. And I think she wound up resenting all of that. And so as soon as the divorce was final, she moved back to Idaho and eventually settled in Utah. So I finished my last couple of years in high school in Salt Lake.
Hey, no, I believe that you were 12 years old when your parents divorced.
Yeah.
But tell us about an experience, and I think this had to be very traumatic for you when you were 8 years old, and your dad evidently had some indications about you. Tell us about that event, Jahn.
I was about 8, and my grandparents had a horse ranch in the hills of Los Angeles, and we spent a lot of time up there. And one of these events, we were raking up the garden and digging and hoeing and doing all that such. And the work was hot and sweaty, and I reached down my pants to adjust things down there because it had gotten a little sticky down there. And my father hit me with an open hand backside of my head, and I wound up face down in the dirt. And I, came up spluttering with dirty face and crying and didn't understand what had just happened to me and why. And then he just said very pointedly that he would not have any fucking faggots in this house. And
Wow.
I did not know what a faggot was. I'd heard the F word before and I knew it was bad, but I knew just by, the implications that a faggot was bad. And it was a few days before I could get a hold of a dictionary and look it up. And it still didn't make sense to me because the dictionary had the old definition for a bundle of sticks. But it wasn't until some years later that I understood clearly that that bundle of sticks was used to refer to when they put homosexuals to the flame in the Middle Ages. And that was a term that even now to this day just offends me no end. I understand the N-word for Black people is very offensive to them. Well, I have the same visceral reaction when someone says the F word. The F word to me is the faggot word. The F word that I'm not so bothered by is the one that Christians get all up in arms about. But that one doesn't bother me like the other one does.
Yes, I understand that. So that had to be obviously traumatic. And I'm sure when that happened, you wanted to hide who you were. And
well,
not
at
be
the time, I did not know who I was. I did not know. I knew that penises would attract me or be interesting to me. If I went to the bathroom and there was a row of urinals, I would, look over at the next row. And as an 8-year-old, I'm at the right height for an adult male to, get an eyeful. And so those would interest me. But I didn't understand what homosexuality was or what being gay was. I just knew that I had those attractions. And I would have, my usual nighttime dreams and wake up with, muck in my shorts. And I wasn't until I was in my early to mid-teens before I even knew what that was. And I knew by the time I was 16 that I was attracted to boys in the way that, my very strict Mormon Christian upbringing defined as evil and sinful, and that I should never do that. And there was lots and lots of speeches over Mormon pulpits and general conference talks that spoke evil about homosexuality and pornography and all of that. So I stayed away from it out of fear.
But how are you? But how are you feeling, Juan, inside? What are you? You're staying away, but what's your feelings that you're going through at the time? You're not acknowledging who you are. How did you deal with it? Did you just kind of cut it off and not think about it?
Well, you're asking a 60-year-old man, to go back into those memories. And, I have the hindsight and the lens that I can look back through that. But at the time, again, not really understanding, what I now define as cognitive dissonance, the two beliefs. The one belief on one hand that I'm a devout Christian and I would never do anything to, defile my body or defile the sanctity of my Mormon and Christian covenants with God. On the other hand, I just had these strong urges, and, just like all emotions, they ebb and flow. Some weeks or months they're strong and others they're not. I deemed them, as per my Mormon beliefs, that this was just the natural urges to procreate with a woman, and I just had to be pure and clean until I got married someday. Right. So I would stuff them down and try not to deal with them, but they'd still come out, and there'd be an occasional interaction with either of my parents, now divorced, where I realized I could never, ever come out to them. They were both still very devout in their belief system and their disgust with homosexuals. If there was a pride event that would come out on the news in the late 70s, or, by the 80s when I'm in college, if there was, any reference to GRID or AIDS. GRID, I think you may recall, was the early version before they renamed it to AIDS. GRID was gay-related immune deficiency. My mom, who was a nurse, who worked at the health department, she would say some rather poignantly disgusted things about those gay men that she had to work with at her work. And I just knew I could never come out to her. It was
so she was homophobic, very homophobic.
Very. Both of them were. But,
and so was your dad.
Yeah. And my mother is still alive and is still very defiantly holding on to her belief that I've chosen to stray from God's plan. And, it's my fault that I've made some bad choices in my life or whatever. Whereas my father, he got kind of read the riot act by his fourth wife, and she made it clear that if he continued down this religious homophobic path, that he would not only lose his relationship with me, but that he would lose relationships with others of his children who had either come out as bi or lesbian or were even just, non-believing Mormon pothead smokers. And so my father eventually did come around, and we enjoyed the last 5 years, of our lives with some decent relationship. My mother still, I think, has been abused by her beliefs in Mormonism, and she's not alone. There are millions of people the world over who have been raised with homophobic beliefs in various religious traditions, and I feel bad for her because it has destroyed her ability to have a relationship with me and, frankly, with several of her other children.
Mm-hmm. I understand that as well too. Now let's talk about, you went to Saudi Arabia. You mentioned it a little earlier. Tell us why you went to Saudi Arabia, and that was a way to deal with your situation. Tell us a little bit more about that.
So I have to go a little bit further backwards in time. After a failed engagement to a woman and then a failed suicide attempt while I was in grad school, my therapist convinced me that I needed to just accept that being gay was better than being dead. And I finally did, and that was a condition of his releasing me from the mental hospital there in Phoenix. And so for the 3 years that I was in Phoenix in grad school, I was ostensibly out gay. I would go to the gay bars and I would, participate in the lifestyle, the clubs on campus and whatever. It filled a little bit of a curiosity, and, the titillation and all was fun, but I really hated it. I hated the whole concept of what was being presented to me as the gay lifestyle. I hated the diseases, the sexually transmitted diseases. I hated the loud, repetitive music at the clubs. I hated the smoking. I hated the drug use. I hated the shallow personalities of people who would want to just hook up and go to the bars on the weekends, and that was their whole life. I was like, I had a bigger, grander view of what my life would be and how I would impact and contribute to the world as a world citizen and to American political life and culture. And going to the bars and getting fucked was just not something that appealed to me long term. So when I was fielding job offers at the end of my degree, one of them was this bank in Saudi Arabia. And so I took it thinking that I would be going to Saudi Arabia and just kind of escaping the whole gay lifestyle. I got to Saudi Arabia and found out that no, the gay lifestyle exists there too, but just in a different form. And as I explained to you, in the same way that prohibition in the United States was a failed experiment because they realized that just making it illegal doesn't make it stop. It just goes underground.
Underground, yes.
And going underground, it kind of combines with a lot of other illegal and sordid elements. And so when I got to Saudi Arabia and men started hitting up on me, I couldn't believe it. I was just, and the Saudi culture has an interesting dichotomy. Like Europe in general, there's a lot of hand holding and kissing on the cheek. Culturally acceptable. It's not meant to be sexual at all. And so, men in Saudi Arabia would hold hands as they walked down the street, and they'd be discussing business, and there'd be nothing sexual about it at all. It's just part of the culture. You would immediately go into a room, and even though they're colleagues, there would be kisses on the cheek, and then you'd go to business. And so when someone was looking at me kind of funkily in the elevator, I didn't know what that was. Was this... And it took me some time to realize that, okay, there's this dual aspect of the Saudi culture. And one is that men are just friendly generally, and two, men generally do want to hook up. And that's partly a consequence of the principle of veiling of women. So in the Quran, it's defined that a woman, after she has her first period, ostensibly a 10, 11, 12-year-old girl, that her mother immediately veils her. She's pulled from school, and she's no longer allowed to have any contact with other men or boys. And so you get junior high and high schools in Saudi Arabia that are segregated. Boys are in one school and girls in the other. Well, I ask you, do these boys not have hormones? And of course they do.
No, they do. Of course they do.
And those boys, instead of because they had no access to the girls, they would play around sexually with themselves. Right. And by the time they're adult men, they'd established their relationships. And the men who truly were heterosexuals, they were just, gratifying the sexual urge until they had their match, until their families had arranged them to get married. And then once they got married, typically these men would go back to just their wives. They would stay straight, and there would be no more of that, thing. We won't talk about what happened in school and that kind of thing. Whereas the ones who are already gay anyway, and now they've been exposed to this, they may have had their arranged marriage and gotten married, but they would go back to either boyfriends on the side, or if it was not available to them within the Saudi kingdom, they would go to Bahrain or Dubai, and even as they had to avoid the Arab culture entirely, they would go as far away as Sri Lanka or Bangkok in order to get their boy sex. And I use the term boy in that regard because, their initial experiences were while they were 12, 14, 16-year-old boys. And so that's what they wanted. And they would go back to those cultures. And so in some respects, and I was there in the 90s, I look at Saudi Arabia as being responsible for the spread of AIDS in Sri Lanka and in Thailand, because boy sex, and it's paid. It's a business for them, is rampant in those cultures, and it's also cause for the spread of AIDS. And I learned a lot of this because I would spend time with some nurses who were American and Canadians who had been working in Saudi Arabia. And this one nurse friend of mine, she was from Ontario, and she had said, that she worked on the 9th floor of the King Fahd Hospital, and that floor had 78 beds that were dedicated to nothing but AIDS patients. Wow. The problem is, it's not just these men. They come back after screwing around in Sri Lanka or wherever, and then they infect their wives. And then their wife is pregnant. She's now infected their brand new baby. And so these protestations by the Saudi government that AIDS didn't exist and that homosexuality didn't exist in the kingdom were false, because, these nurses were, testifying to the fact that the AIDS ward was 50-50, 50% men, 50% women, which I find to be atrocious. But anyway, I'm getting way off key, but my time in Saudi Arabia, I was there 3 years. I had a lot of good experiences because it's an interesting and unique culture, and I'm an adventurous type soul. But the whole aspect of sexuality there caused me to have even more anxiety and stress, and I wound up deciding to quit my job and come back to the U.S. so that I could get therapy. And in my mind, therapy meant conforming to the Mormon commandments because that's what I want. I wanted to come back to being a good Mormon, and I'd already been excommunicated from the church at that point, and so I had to go through a bunch of hoops and follow a bunch of commandments and have a bunch of interviews before I could be rebaptized into the Mormon church.
Okay, let's talk about that, because talk about evergreen. Define to our audience what evergreen was. I think Dave Matheson talked about it briefly, and I believe your mother was one on the committee for Evergreen. Is that correct?
She was on the board.
On the board, okay.
Directors. And at one point, my then future father-in-law, now ex-father-in-law, was also, they both spent 5 years each on the board. And I've known a number of other people who were on the board, or I learned about them and became acquainted with them because of their positions. But as I mentioned to you in our earlier discussion, Evergreen started out with 9 men who wanted to stay true to Mormon standards and to the Christian commandments of celibacy or fidelity in marriage. And so it was more or less an AA.
A support group. It was a support
group. It was just a bunch of guys. Anybody who says that Evergreen, was conducting therapy or whatever, conversion therapy, that's just false. It didn't happen. Now, these support groups, sometimes they would invite a therapist to come and talk to them. And then afterwards, if you wanted to take the therapist's business card and select and arrange your own therapy with that therapist on your own, and then you could do that and you could participate in conversion therapy. But Evergreen was not about that. Evergreen was just simply a place for people who shared the same goals, who wanted to be good Mormons, who also struggled with their internal sexual orientation. And I made some good friends there. And unlike a lot of other guys who kind of used Evergreen as a hookup place, I really didn't do that. I mean, I did hook up with a couple over the course of the 12 years that I was involved, but I know other guys that, every Wednesday night support group was, a great thing to discuss. And then afterwards they'd, have hookup sessions, and that wasn't me. And so that perhaps is where some of the bad press comes from that.
Well, okay, now from Evergreen, it wasn't. Okay, I understand it was a support group, but you've been through conversion therapy. You've been through electric shock.
And was that during that time when I came back to Saudi Arabia?
Was that under Dean Byrd?
Not Senator Dean Byrd. I interned as a intern for Senator Byrd in Washington, D.C. But okay. I did get conversion therapy or reparative therapy of homosexuality from Dean Byrd, who was a doctor here in Salt Lake. Yes. Dean Byrd was involved with NARTH and the Exodus groups. He was the chief commissioner for Mormon Family Therapeutic Services. And so
just tell us a little bit about what he did. Did he then do conversion therapy? Did he do the electric shock?
No. And people,
did not.
As I mentioned to you also, the term SOCE or SOCE, sexual orientation change efforts, which is referred to by the APA as failed, that it demonstrates that it not only has failed in its efforts to change orientation, but it also is harmful. So under that big umbrella of the term SOCE, sexual orientation change efforts, conversion therapy is the term that people like to use. Almost invariably, they're using electroshock. But electroshock is only one of maybe 10 or 11 different reparative therapy treatment styles. David Matheson, who you interviewed, was one of those therapists who worked with Dr. Nicolosi, and they used predominantly a cognitive therapy approach. So it was talk therapy. There was no electroshock therapy being done. I don't know of any that David conducted. He may have been able to shed more light on that in his interview. But when Dr. Byrd and I met, he still had an office with the Mormon Church's Office of Family Therapy. Social services is what they called it. And there was no electroshock. It was just simply cognitive therapy with the intent to change my orientation. And after about 2.5 years of that, almost 3 years, he mentioned to me in one of our sessions that he was going to suggest that we move away from reparative therapy and just focus on cognitive therapy to deal with my other issues. And in his view, my story was very similar to a lot of gay men in the United States, and that may or may not be corollary to a lot of gay men worldwide. But here in the United States, there's a lot of commonalities that, unfortunately, a lot of people, they think that correlation is the same as causation, and it's not. One of the commonalities is that I'm a sensitive person, and that because I'm a bit of a perfectionist and living in a conservative religious environment with a very domineering or aggressive father, some would say even abusive, and then with when the father's gone, a domineering and aggressive mother who's trying to direct my path both as a child and then later as an adult, and that these were common themes. And so he pointed out that, these issues that I just mentioned weren't causal to my being homosexual. They were just corollaries. And he at least admitted, I know he's kind of hated in the Mormon gay community because he did practice reparative therapy. But, and I've talked to several others like me who received treatment from him. And we've all in agreement that Dr. Bird was generally a very kind man who really cared about his patients. And when he saw that the therapy that he was attempting to treat us with was not being effective, and so he would switch to other ways to deal with our emotional distress rather than attempt to try and change our sexuality. Does that make sense?
So let me ask a question, because you've had electric shock therapy. Is that correct?
1980 at BYU.
Okay, you've had electric shock therapy, and I believe you said that created PTSD for you. Is that correct?
It was very strong PTSD, and it took me years. In fact, now I look backwards and I can see that Mormon church leaders and their dogma have caused more pain and suffering, more suicides, because of this stupid, defiant belief that they could change sexuality. And this belief in Mormon doctrine continued into the 2010s before they finally abandoned it and accepted that they did not know what caused homosexuality. And they stopped supporting groups like Evergreen that advocated for SOCE, sexual orientation change efforts. So back in the 60s, one of the Mormon leaders, Dallin Oaks, was tapped. He had been a professor of law at University of Chicago, and the Mormon church leaders had tapped him to be the new president of BYU. And in that process, he brought with him several of his staff and some of the professors from University of Chicago to teach at BYU. One of them was a professor who was experimenting with this concept of electroshock therapy. Now, electroshock therapy is a broad term. It's not the same thing as electroshock aversion therapy. And aversion therapy is where they're trying to stop you from having attraction. So, for instance, they would use electroshock aversion therapy to stop people from smoking. They would use it in other ways where it might, because if you got shocked whenever you smelled a cigarette smoke, you would maybe stop wanting to smoke again. Well, they thought that it would do the same thing with sexuality. If you got shocked every time you got an arousal when they showed you a pornographic image of a man, then it would somehow change you to stop this desire for men.
That is totally wrong, and that is totally indecent.
Yeah, and it has been since debunked.
That's why conversion therapy is so wrong. I mean, the state of Arizona now, the governor has, you cannot practice it there anymore.
Not true. And the state of Arizona can still practice electroshock therapy. What you just described is what 18 states have done, which is they have made conversion therapy illegal for minors. And that's a very big distinction. While a parent now can't force a child to endure it in my state, in Utah, or your state in Arizona, they can still go to Oklahoma. They can still go to Texas and be pressured into this treatment. And those are just the minors. And then you've got adults who,
Yeah.
they want to still be good Catholics or good Baptists or good Muslims or whatever, and they still are subjecting themselves to this treatment, which it has been shown by the medical communities to be not only ineffective, but it also is harmful, and yet it's still practiced. So people need to remember that when they hear, oh, conversion therapy has been banned in my state, no, it hasn't. In all 50 states, conversion therapy is still legal. Conversion therapy in your state may be banned for minors and minors only.
Okay. Well, I think we need to have a voice on that and continue to have a voice, because I think it should be banned for everyone. It's inhuman and it is wrong.
I'll sign my name to any petition you want to get started.
Yeah. Well, but I also, and it's like Dave Matheson said on I interviewed him. He said, if it wasn't for organized religion, we would not have conversion therapy. It's religion that has put this on their people and considers the fact is that what your gender, whether you're gay, whether you're bi, whether you're trans, whether you're, I mean, you cannot change who a person was born to be. And I think
you're correct. But it took a long time for science to figure that out, honestly. I mean, it was probably in the early 80s with Dr. Spitzer, who, by the way, Dr. Spitzer was the therapist from New York who was one of the originals who had gotten it changed in the 70s, so that the DSM, at that point, the DSM-3, now we're at the DSM-5, but the Diagnostic Manual of Mental Disorders used to have homosexuality as a mental disorder, and he got it. He was part of those that got it changed, but it took a while because he practiced reparative therapy. I mean, Spitzer was one of those who basically had a final change of mind because he saw the data. He saw the suffering of his patients, people that came into him for therapy and for treatment, and then it wasn't working. And so, but it wasn't enough to just have anecdotal evidence with 1 or 2 or 10 of his clients. It had to be across the board. And so were thousands of men and women, because let's face it, reparative therapy is not just practiced on men in this country, it's on women as well. But what you just mentioned earlier is so true. David Matheson is right that religion is what drives this. Religions are what give men like David Matheson and Nicolosi and the others who practiced it for 30, 40 years, it gave them jobs. It gave them, the ability to earn money by treating people who, like me, desired to be true to their faith and true to their religious requirements, and they were willing to subject themselves to this horrible treatment. And while I personally believe we're going to have trouble in the United States with any law that bans it, because this country, the first 4 amendments are very clear. People have the right to be stupid, and that means if you want to smoke, you have the right to be a smoker, as an adult. Because even though science has proven that smoking is horribly damaging to your body, we're still going to allow it. And so it's true with reparative therapy. Even though science has proven that it's damaging, it's wrong, it's not helpful, you have a right as an adult to be stupid if you want to, I don't know how we're going to be able to do it.
I guess in a way, suicide, even though it is rampant in conversion therapy, you can't stop a person if they want to take their life.
And this is where we really need the help of the elected officials, especially nationally, because the elected officials are in the position where they can mandate that this data be collected so that universities and other think tanks can use the data to help show. But the problem is when you get a death certificate and someone has committed suicide, the death certificate may say suicide on it, but it doesn't say patient suffered from homosexual feelings and felt rejected by their families. Because that secondary information is something that's often deemed too private to share. Families will object to sharing it when, the universities or whatever want to contact them about it. And municipalities that collect those death certificates and corroborate them, they refuse to reveal that information And so we're left to speculate. We're left and I know a few researchers who do this. They read obituaries and they scan them for evidence of suicides, because sometimes it won't even say suicide. Our loved one left us on Friday and blah, blah, blah. It doesn't say that he committed suicide because he was horribly, horribly, horribly depressed and why he was depressed. But this information is important. It's important to gather it and to demonstrate it so that we can then turn around and represent it back to our lawmakers to say, look, we need laws that prohibit discrimination. Now, there's been a lot of progress in our country, in the United States, regarding laws protecting LGBTQ people, but there's been a lot of backsliding as well, as we've seen in Texas and other states where these kinds of laws, it's hard to enforce locally if the federal government hasn't established one. And this is something I mentioned to you in our preview discussion yesterday. We as a community, anybody who's listening to this podcast, please write your senator, write your congressman or congresswoman, and let them know that we need to pass the Equality Act. Now, the Equality Act, unlike other previous acts that have been passed, does not have a carve out for religions. So people will say, well, my state, New York, Florida, or not Florida, Utah, California, they protect LGBTQ people. And I would say yes. And in some states like New York and Utah, they protect them, except there's a carve out for religion. So people who work for a large religion, the Catholic Church is a large employer in the state of New York. The Mormon Church is a large employer in the state of Utah. And those churches, they lobbied to get these laws passed because the carve-out gives them the ability to now continue to discriminate. So here in Mormon land in Utah, there are 3 large universities that are part of the Mormon church system. And we're talking the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the Mormon Church, is the largest employer in the state of Utah. But not a single Mormon is protected from being fired from their job if they're found out to be gay, because the Mormon Church has the right as a church to fire somebody. And the problem is now with these students in these various church universities, if they're found out to be gay, not only can they be expelled from the university, but they can be evicted from their housing. And then they wind up being homeless because their families won't take them back in because they found out that they were gay. And so these kids, these 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds suffer horribly in this state. And I can't speak to what it is in New York other than what I've read about, similar situations where if you protect the church, then essentially you are still giving a loophole for this religious discrimination. So back to that original comment, it is religions that are the
organized religion. Yeah.
Organized religion is the foundation of the discrimination against LGBTQ people. And that's in this country, but it's also true worldwide. I mean, I have witnessed with my own eyes decapitations in Saudi Arabia and hangings in Pakistan for homosexuals. And let me tell you, the first time I saw one of those events, I vomited, and then I had to go home and I cried for hours. It wasn't a person that I knew, but just the fact that this person was homosexual gave the Islamic Republic of Pakistan and the Islamic monarchy of Saudi Arabia the right to kill them. And, that they follow the Sharia law. It's the law in their country. Well, the law in our country hasn't been so great over the last 250 years, but, we're making progress, but we need everybody to rise up. I mean, I know you've got a lot of people who listen to this podcast who some of them are homosexual or on the LGBTQ spectrum. Some of them are just allies. But in any event, it doesn't matter who you are, what state you live in, even if you're in Guam or you live in Japan and you're just listening to this, online. We need you to write to your congressmen and your senators and let them know that the Equality Act is going to protect people. It's going to save lives, because you know what? I had one person say to me, well, but there are not that many, LGBTQ people. There's only 2-3% of you in the country. And I'm like, no, actually in the population, the LGBTQ spectrum, which is quite wide, is between 8 and 10% of the population. So with 330 million people in this country, You're talking at least 30 million people. And if we save one of those lives, is that not worth it? Is not your letter to the senator worth it?
I agree with you. Jan, I totally agree with you. And that's why I have a voice, and that's why I do the podcast. And I want to just tailgate on one of the comments you made. Outright International, and it's on my podcast with Katie Hillcrest, just passed a law about a month ago, pushed by North American religion, that if you are a doctor or a parent or a teacher and you know the child is gay and you don't report it, you get an automatic prison sentence.
Right.
11 countries still kill them for being gay. I mean, so that's shocking. I support these organizations, and the profits from my book and my podcast go to support them, because we need to have a voice. We need to make some difference. You know, people can listen to this podcast and they can say, well, I get that and I understand that. And they can think something, but they think it. And if they don't do it, then they don't have a voice. So that's why they need to have a voice. And I think you so clearly brought that out. And Jan, I applaud you for that. I applaud you that. I want to talk a little bit about your family, because I know you were married to your ex-wife, who was obviously a Mormon, still is a Mormon. You have children, a boy and a girl. I believe one of them is on a mission, your boy, for the Mormon church. Tell me about, obviously, you lost connection because of what was done by your ex-wife. And and because of that, and infiltrating the kids, it put distance between you. Tell us a little bit about that, how that happened, and what your relationship is with your kids today, your children, grown children.
So I have 3 kids, 2 that are biological and 1 that was a foster son that I adopted. As you just mentioned, my youngest son is on a Mormon mission in Washington, and I miss him dearly. I think about him every day. My middle daughter served a mission as well in Germany and came back 3 years ago, and we have not had much contact. I did recently reconnect with my daughter, but it's going to be baby steps. A lot of what both of my younger children were told by their mother was just not true. It was a litany of things that were based in ignorance and fear. When my now ex-wife and I were first dating, she knew everything that I knew about my sexuality. She participated with me at evergreen events, and we participated in there was no podcast back in the 90s, but there were interviews that went into interviews that would be videoed and then put on the Evergreen website. And in fact, our testimonies stayed on the website for several years after our divorce. And I essentially called David Pruden and wrote him a letter and said, look, you need to take our testimonials down. It's just not right. So, but in any event, she knew what I knew. And as I mentioned to you yesterday, I believe both of us were naive, because our intention in getting married, we wanted to be happy together. I mean, I loved her, but I wasn't in love with her in the way that I have since been with a man. And a lot of that is because the Mormon church doctrine, which is a purity culture, you're not allowed to be, you have to be a virgin before marriage. And right. Well, that may be nice in theory, but in practice, it's not very good, because for one thing, sexual compatibility is something that needs to be determined before marriage, for a marriage to be successful, in my opinion. And the other thing is that ignorance is how the church controls and maintains the membership. And so if we don't know enough about, 1, homosexuality, and 2, and this is a whole side topic, is the falsehoods taught by the Mormon church, then I just went with what the church brethren promised me. I was given blessings where they would lay their hands on my head and they would use olive oil as dictated in the Old Testament. And these blessings would say, if you get married to this woman, you'll be, blessed. The Lord will bless you. And these feelings that you have for men will go away, and you'll be able to continue on as the Lord wants you to do. And, my hope and my faith was that this would happen. And, within the first week or so of the marriage, I realized, one, that was not true. And two, 5 years later, with a lot of, unhappiness on both sides, it left me with a lot of bitterness towards these men who, claimed to be leaders of the church, and even the local ones. The local ones had good intention. The local bishops and stake presidents had good intentions, but it's the higher ups, which in the Catholic Church would be cardinals and whatnot. For the Mormon Church, these were 70s and apostles. These were the men who were the gatekeepers to allow me to, one, get rebaptized and come back in the church, and two, give me a temple recommend so I could get married in the temple. And these were the men who would make these promises and, pronounce these blessings on my head. They did not know what the hell they were talking about. And it makes me angry because none of them had ever, taken a course, much less a degree in genetic or homosexual studies. They didn't understand that my being homosexual was not a cause of sin. It wasn't because I masturbated as a teenager. For one thing, I was a virgin until I was 30, and I'd never masturbated. But they want to keep repeating these tired and old, wives' tales that, well, if you masturbate. I mean, I remember somebody saying to me that, when you masturbate, your ear will fall off, or some other stupid, you'll go blind, or these other stupid things. And they're still telling kids that this is what they should do. Don't masturbate or else you might become gay. And I'm angry because this kind of misinformation, and we're seeing a whole lot of that in our culture, misinformation is what leads people to do stupid and unkind things. It's what leads these dumb 20-year-olds and teenagers to go down to the gay bars. Can't speak to other cities, but here in Salt Lake, we had a few of them, where they'd go down to the gay bars late at night and they'd have bats, and they'd wait for guys to come out of the gay bar and they'd bash them. Gay bashing was a thing here, and this was not too long after Matthew Shepard was killed. This was a cultural problem that I believe the church is responsible for, because it's taught these young men that, our being gay is wrong and evil, and so they're going to take it upon themselves to fix the problem by killing us.
Yeah, that is so sad. And
it is sad. And
very sad. And again, it gets back to the word inhuman. I want to talk about at the end of our podcast here. First of all, I want to thank you, Juan, so much for opening up and being vulnerable and courage to share this story. I understand, as a patient of conversion therapy, the damage it does, and as you mentioned, cause PTSD. And I acknowledge that, and that's one of the reasons I am, and I think our listeners, there may be some listening that are in favor of it, but they need to get the data. They need to listen to the information. They need people who have been through it, people who have taught it. I want them to have data, and that's the reason my podcast I do on this is to give them data, information. Don't put your head in the sand. Research it, see what's going on. And these podcasts are giving you a patient and one who also performed conversion or repetitive theory of repetitive conversion.
Imperative, yeah.
Yes, that's got to get the word out there right. But I want to ask you, because one of the things on my podcast, and I asked you this yesterday, Jahn, people may be struggling. Maybe they've been through repetitive therapy. Many of them don't talk about it. I know several have been through it and they won't even talk about it. That's how much damage it's done. What would you like them, if they're struggling with something, what would you like them to know by your story?
Well, I kind of got sidetracked. There are two aspects to that response. First is, the greatest of my pain so far has been the loss of relationships with my children because of how they've been brainwashed to believe that I'm a sinner, that I'm not worthy of their love or their respect. And while, as I mentioned, I barely had a recent connection with my daughter, I still don't have a good relationship with her, and I still have no relationship with my son. It's painful, and it's painful to the extent that I have other psychosomatic illness and depression issues. And here I am at 60, I should be having the time of my life with, top of my career, whatever. And I am unhappy because of the loss of that relationship. And so, to the second part of that question, it's don't give up. It's going to be hard, and there are going to be some days when you just want to give up. And I have to lean back on something that Dr. Bird said to me early on in my days when I was first getting therapy from him. And he said that, Jahn, and I was in my late 30s at that point. And he said, Jahn, you're an adult man now in charge of the child that once was. And so whatever damage that you sustained as a child in your home of growing up and whatever happened, you can't go back and change that, but you're now responsible for caring for that little boy inside you. And he said, what you need to do is you need to step back, and as if you're an observer, you think back of when your father slapped you, or when your mother said this to you, or whatever. And then how would you comfort that little boy in his tears and in his silence and loneliness? And I started to tear up because I realized that's what was needed. I needed to say the things to me, to myself, that others were not saying, that my parents were not saying. And my parents, in their, good intentions, they didn't understand. They didn't understand the long-term consequences of their words and actions and how it has hurt me. But this is true for every single person on this planet. Not a single one of us grew up with perfect parents. They did their best based on the information they had and their own limitations and character flaws and whatever. And, goes back to hundreds of centuries before us. So you can stay wallowing in your misery. And that was another thing he said is, pain comes. You're going to have a pain. It's going to come. And there's going to be lots of pains in life. But misery is optional. Your choice to stay in misery is your choice, what you do about it. And so in the end, when I say don't give up, I don't mean that in that platitude sense, because it's hard. But you do have to take steps, whether they're little or big, on each day to take care of yourself, to say those nice things to yourself, those self-affirmations. There's a reason why there's a whole theory of that self-affirmation. There's a whole movement, in podcasts and whatever to say those things. And so for me, it's, if you are facing a hard time, start today with something that you need for you to help you heal. And if you have to go back to when you're a child to kind of say those things, or even it was just an injury that happened last week because a coworker said something really ugly behind your back and you heard it, and you're going to have to heal yourself from that injury. And you have to take the step. Nobody else can do it. Nobody is going to be able to fix the problems in your own head. That's something you have to do.
Thank you. That is so encouraging, and I so get that. And I know, and I want to share this. Jahn is suffering medically. I believe you have cancer.
Yes.
That's a hard thing to do. I know you're going to be having open heart surgery. So he needs a family. He needs a family. This is time for us to support Juan. It's time for us to be able to be a friend of his, because it's kind of interesting. Juan shared with me yesterday that sometime when you're going through these terminal cases of cancer, sometimes your community disappears. But you know what? I want all my podcasters to be a community there for Juan and a community to one another. I think his advice about taking care of the child within you makes so much sense. But I can say for me personally, I'll make this commitment on my podcast. I will keep in contact with you, Juan. You're not going to get rid of me. I will be your family. And the fact I want to keep you're doing with your cancer, I want to know about your open heart surgery. I will be a community. So the very fact that you were able to do a podcast with me, that we got connected, I think you're going to save a lot of people. You're going to help a lot of people in this podcast. And by the way, you're a part of my community, and I will not lose contact with you. That's my promise to you, Juan. Thank you so much.
You can
on my
start by calling me Jahn.
Oh, did I say Juan again? I know
one or two times.
Yes, I did. Okay, I know it's Jahn. It's Jahn.
I'll put a sombrero on my head and a serape here, and then the Juan Nomenclature will stick.
Well, thank you so much, Jahn, for doing my podcast. You've been a great interview. I've done a great interview with you, and I want to thank you for your words of wisdom. Thanks for sharing your experiences, your heartache, and your struggles. And I still am going to have a hope that you'll connect with your kids again. That's my hope for you. Thank you so much.
Go out and vote.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye now. Thanks so much.